Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The Ghost Ship.
It was around 5:30 in the morning when I first spotted it. Just a shadow against the horizon, barely noticeable in the early light. I was out on my fishing boat, like I do most mornings, looking forward to a quiet, peaceful day on the water. The sea was calm, and the sky was still dark, the sun not quite up yet. I had a good feeling about the day, but I didn't know then that it would turn into something I'd never forget. At first, I thought it was another boat, maybe a fishing vessel or a tour boat that had been left out overnight. But as I got closer, I realized something was off. This boat, it didn't look right. It was much bigger than mine, with old, peeling paint and no sign of movement. The way it sat on the water was strange, almost as if it had been abandoned, left to drift aimlessly. I couldn't see anyone on board. Curiosity got the better of me, and against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I didn't know why, but something about this boat pulled me toward it. I steered my boat toward it, cutting through the still waters. The boat was almost silent, the only sound the gentle swish of the water against the sides of my vessel. As I approached, I noticed that it was large, way too large to be some random boat someone left behind. The deck was empty, but it looked like it had been lived in not too long ago. I could see remnants of what appeared to be belongings scattered across the deck, an overturned coffee cup, a jacket tossed across the railing, a pair of boots left behind as if someone had just stepped off. I hesitated, my hand on the throttle, but the curiosity gnawed at me. I tied my boat to the side of the abandoned one and slowly climbed aboard. The silence hit me first. It wasn't the kind of silence you expect on an old boat. It was unnatural, suffocating, like the air itself was holding its breath. I stepped onto the creaky deck, my boots making a hollow sound against the wooden boards. "Hello," I called out, trying to break the uneasy stillness. No response. The ship, or whatever it was, seemed empty. But the more I looked around, the more I noticed small details that didn't quite sit right. There was a chair by the table, the kind you see on old boats. And the oddest thing, it was pulled out slightly, as if someone had just stood up from it. "Hello," I called again, my voice echoing across the deck. There was still no answer. I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, a sense that something wasn't right. I turned to leave, but then I saw something else. A faint, almost imperceptible movement near the edge of the deck. My heart skipped. A shadow. No, it wasn't a shadow. It was a figure, half-formed, as if it had been fading into the ship itself, but it was there. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me in the early morning light. The figure was gone before I could fully comprehend what I'd just seen, but the unsettling feeling stayed with me. Something was off about this boat. I was about to leave, to cut my losses and get the hell out of there, when I heard it. A soft, almost inaudible whisper, coming from deep inside the ship. "Help!" I froze, my blood running cold. I stood there, frozen in place, the soft whisper still echoing in my ears. For a split second, I thought I had imagined it. But then, I heard it again, clearer this time. "Help!" It was a voice that wasn't my own. It came from somewhere deep within the bowels of the ship. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to move toward it. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, but it was no use. Something was pulling me forward. I stepped cautiously into the narrow corridor below deck. The air grew heavier the further I went, almost thick, like I was walking through a dense fog. The space was cramped, and the smell of mildew and salt hung in the air. The dim light from my flashlight barely cut through the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to shift as I moved. "Is anyone down here?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly, despite my attempts to sound confident. Nothing. The walls creaked as I moved deeper into the ship, my footsteps echoing unnervingly loud in the silence. It felt like the entire boat was holding its breath, waiting. But then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard it again. Louder now, like it was right behind me. "Help!" I whipped around, shining my flashlight in every direction. The beam flickered for a moment, casting long, jittery shadows across the walls. I could feel my heart racing in my chest. No one was there, but the voice, it was real. I knew it was. I couldn't see anything, but I swore I felt something shift in the air. A chill ran down my spine as the temperature dropped in the room. My breath became visible in the cold, and for the first time, I started to feel the weight of the danger around me. It was then that I noticed the strange marks on the walls. They were faint, almost like they had been scratched in desperation, as though someone or something had been trying to escape. I knelt down, shining my flashlight on the marks. There were deep gouges, some of them so fresh they almost seemed to still be oozing something dark and viscous. My stomach turned. What the hell was I looking at? A sudden thud echoed from above, making me jump. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, I thought I heard footsteps, too, heavy and uneven. But when I looked around, the space was as still as before. The whisper came again, but this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was a hiss. "Get out!" I didn't need to be told twice. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get the hell off this haunted ship. I turned and bolted for the stairs leading back up to the deck, my breath coming in short gasps. But as I reached the top of the stairs, something stopped me in my tracks. There was movement on the deck. I wasn't alone. A figure stood in the shadows near the railing, its outline barely visible in the dim light. My heart stopped. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its shape was wrong. It didn't look like a person. Not entirely. I tried to scream, but the words caught in my throat. The figure didn't move at first, just stood there, watching me. The whispering voice, the one I had heard in the depths of the ship, seemed to come from the very air around it. "Leave now." I stumbled back, terror flooding my veins. I turned to flee, but the moment I did, I felt the boat rock violently, as if something huge had collided with it. I grabbed the railing, trying to steady myself, but the boat began to tilt. The water around it churned like a storm was rolling in, though the sky was still clear. I had to get off this damn boat. I ran back to my own vessel as fast as I could, my legs shaking. When I untied my boat from the abandoned one, I glanced back one last time. The figure was gone. The boat was silent again. But the feeling of being watched, it lingered, and the whisper, faint but clear, followed me as I started the engine. "Don't go." I thought I was out of danger. I really did. As I sped away from that cursed boat, I thought I had escaped whatever dark force had been pulling me into its grip. The engine roared to life, and the boat sliced through the water, my hands gripped tightly on the wheel, my pulse still racing. But even as I put distance between myself and that derelict ship, something gnawed at me, something I couldn't shake. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that figure looming on the horizon, but there was nothing. The sea was calm, the morning light was creeping up, and everything seemed peaceful again. Too peaceful. But the unease in my gut wouldn't go away. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the adrenaline, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the abandoned boat, to the voices, to the strange markings, and to that shadowy figure. I pulled out my phone, fingers trembling as I swiped through the contacts. I needed to talk to someone, anyone, but the reception was spotty out here. The call failed twice. It felt like the sea itself was blocking me, cutting me off from the world. I stared at the empty screen, a cold sweat prickling my skin. What the hell was happening? I was about to try again when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But then the voice came, louder this time. Help! My breath caught in my throat. It was the same voice from the boat. The same whisper that had followed me, even now, as I tried to escape. I jerked my head up, scanning the water around me, but there was no one there. The sea stretched out endlessly in all directions. No boats, no figures, no sign of life. Help! The voice came again, clearer, more urgent. It was coming from beneath the water this time. I froze, terror creeping up my spine. The voice was so familiar, like it was calling to me from the deep, almost as if it had been waiting for me to listen. I could feel the chill in the air, the water growing colder by the second, as though the very ocean was responding to whatever force was calling my name. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to panic. I had to stay calm. I had to focus. But the voice, God, it was so close now. And with every repetition of that haunting plea, I felt myself being pulled back, drawn toward the very thing I had just escaped. Before I knew it, my hands were no longer gripping the wheel. They were reaching for the side of the boat, my body moving on its own, as though something was guiding me, pushing me toward the edge. I snapped back to reality just in time. I yanked my hand away, cursing under my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't let it control me. I had to fight it. But it was too late. The boat rocked violently, like something huge had just brushed past it. My vision blurred, and I almost lost my balance, scrambling to hold onto the railing. Get out! The voice was louder now, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the sea anymore. It was coming from inside my own head. I looked around frantically, trying to make sense of what was happening. The water was still calm. The sun was up now, casting a soft golden glow over the horizon. But it felt wrong, like everything was distorted, like the world was holding its breath. I reached for my phone again, but when I glanced down, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The screen was cracked. The call log was filled with unknown numbers. Numbers I didn't recognize. But it wasn't the numbers that chilled me. It was the name at the top of the screen. Unknown. I quickly turned the phone over, as if trying to erase the evidence, but the damage had already been done. The whispers were back, louder now, filling my ears, swirling around me like the wind. Get out! I felt my hands tremble. It was like the boat was no longer mine, like something else had taken control of it, of me. The water churned beneath, and the sky darkened, despite it being broad daylight. The boat started to veer off course on its own. I tried to correct the wheel, but it was like something was resisting me, pulling me in a different direction. My body felt heavy, my limbs sluggish, like I was sinking into the very depths of the ocean itself. And then I saw it. A figure, barely visible against the water, emerging from the mist. It was tall, impossibly tall, its shape blurry but unmistakable. The figure moved toward me, its outline jagged and distorted, like it wasn't fully part of this world. "Leave this place," the voice whispered again, but this time it was not just a whisper. It was a command. I tried to fight it. I tried to pull away, to turn the boat back around, but the figure was getting closer, and I felt myself growing weaker, drained of all energy. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. Get out. The last thing I remember was the boat rocking violently, as if something had collided with it. The sky went completely dark, and the whispers surrounded me, consuming me, drowning out everything else. And then, nothing. I don't know how long I was unconscious. It could have been hours, or maybe it was just a few minutes. All I knew was that when I opened my eyes, I was no longer in control. The boat was still drifting, but it wasn't the same. The water around me had a sickly greenish tint to it, and the mist, thick and suffocating, clung to everything. I could barely see past the edge of the boat, and the air felt heavy, almost like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me with every breath I took. I tried to sit up, but my body felt stiff and heavy, like I'd been lying still for far too long. My head was pounding, my vision blurred. My mouth was dry, and when I tried to call out, no sound came. It was as if the very air around me had stolen my voice. Then I remembered. The figure, the whispers, the feeling of being dragged, pulled toward something I couldn't escape. I snapped my head around, panic rising in my chest, but there was no figure in sight. The mist had thickened, and the world around me felt disjointed, like it was slipping through my fingers. I grabbed the sides of the boat, my fingers aching as I held on, trying to steady myself. But the moment I touched the metal, a jolt of cold shot through my body, deep, bone-chilling cold that made me freeze. Something was in the water, something I couldn't see but could feel, just beneath the surface. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but it only made the darkness around me feel deeper. The boat rocked again, harder this time, as if something huge was circling me, waiting. "Help me!" The voice came again, this time clearer than before, but it wasn't just one voice. It was dozens, maybe more. They were all calling out to me, each one pulling me in a different direction, each one sounding so familiar, like voices I should recognize, but I couldn't. My heart was hammering in my chest. I tried to stand, but my legs gave out beneath me, and I fell hard onto the deck. "Don't listen to them," a voice whispered, not from the water, but from somewhere inside the boat itself. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing. "Who's there?" I gasped, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. But there was no answer. Just the deafening silence, broken only by the whispers that continued to swirl around me. I tried to ignore them. I tried to focus, to think rationally, but it was like the boat was alive, like it was pulling me in, urging me to stay. The longer I stayed, the more I felt like I was losing myself, like I was becoming a part of it. Then I saw it. A figure, once again, standing at the edge of the mist. I could barely make out its shape, but it was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen. The silhouette was jagged, like it was moving in and out of focus, flickering between this world and something else. It didn't look human, not entirely. I felt my body tense, a cold sweat breaking out over my skin. My throat closed up, and I struggled to breathe. I didn't want to look away, but I couldn't look at it any longer. Something in me told me that if I did, I'd never escape. The boat rocked again, violently this time, and the whispers crescendoed, all of them saying the same thing. "Join us!" I could feel the cold creeping up my spine, my heart pounding in my chest as if it were trying to escape my rib cage. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to swim, to escape this nightmare. But where could I go? The sea was vast, the mist endless. There was no escape. Then the boat lurched, throwing me forward, and I heard a noise, a deep, guttural scraping sound from beneath the hull. It was the kind of sound that made your skin crawl, like something was scratching at the very bones of the boat, trying to break through. I grabbed the edge of the boat, my hands trembling, and that's when I saw it. The markings. They were etched into the wood beneath my hands, twisted symbols and patterns that seemed to move as I stared at them, writhing and shifting like they were alive. The boat wasn't just a boat. It was part of whatever force had claimed this place, part of whatever was pulling me under. I didn't know how long I could hold on. "Get out," the voice whispered, this time right beside me, in my ear. It wasn't a plea anymore. It was an order. I tried to push myself up, but my legs wouldn't move. I could feel the boat sinking, slowly but surely. It was as if the sea had claimed it, claimed me, and I was being dragged under, 1 inch at a time. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the voices, the cold, the whispers. I thought of nothing but the sound of the waves, the sound of my heartbeat, and the sinking feeling in my stomach. But I couldn't escape. I was trapped, and I knew, deep down, that whatever was in the water wasn't going to let me go. Not without a price. I don't remember how long I drifted in and out of consciousness. Maybe it was minutes, or maybe hours. The darkness pressed against me, a suffocating weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. My mind was foggy, my thoughts slipping through my fingers like sand. I tried to move, tried to lift my body, but I couldn't. It was like my limbs were tied to the boat, weighed down by an invisible force, and the harder I tried to break free, the more it held me. Then I felt it. A cold hand, icy, bone-chilling, brush against my leg. I screamed, or at least I tried to. No sound came out. The cold hand squeezed tighter, pulling me down. I thrashed against it, my heart pounding in terror. The boat rocked violently, and I could hear the whispering voices again, louder now, swirling around me like a storm. "Join us." The words were like a chorus of countless souls, each one more desperate than the last. They all spoke in unison, their voices overlapping, their tones filled with a sense of longing and despair. But it wasn't just the voices that haunted me now. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something was in the water with me, something ancient and hungry, something that wanted me to stay. I fought harder, pushing against the water, against the invisible grip that held me. But the boat was sinking faster now, and I could feel the cold waves lapping at my chest. The mist had thickened to the point where I couldn't see more than a few inches in front of me. I was completely blind to the world around me, trapped in this nightmare, a prisoner of the sea. And then I heard it, the sound of a man laughing. It was low and guttural, like the laugh of someone who had gone mad, someone who knew far too much. I jerked my head toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Just the endless mist, just the never-ending waves. I heard it again, louder this time. "Help me," a voice whispered, but it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of them, all calling my name, all coming from different directions. It was like they were all around me, closing in, suffocating me with their desperation. I was drowning in their voices, drowning in their need. I tried to scream again, but it felt like my throat was full of sand. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The boat was gone now. I was floating in the open water, surrounded by the endless dark. My limbs felt heavy, as if the weight of the ocean itself was pulling me under. I could feel the current dragging me deeper, and the cold was unbearable. It wasn't just the cold of the water, it was the cold of something else, something far darker and older, something that had been waiting for me. "Join us!" The voices came again, more insistent this time, their whispers like a rope tightening around my neck. I tried to fight, but I was too weak. I was too tired. The sea had taken everything from me, my strength, my will, my very soul. I felt it, deep in my bones. I was never meant to leave. This was where I would stay, lost to the deep, a part of the boat, a part of the mist. Then I saw it, a shape, just beneath the surface of the water. I couldn't make it out clearly, but I knew it was watching me. I knew it was waiting. The darkness surrounded me, swallowing me whole. I could no longer hear the voices. I could no longer feel the cold hand that had pulled me under. All I could hear was the deafening silence, the crushing weight of the ocean, and the terrible knowledge that I was lost. And as I sank deeper into the water, I felt something pulling me down, down into the depths. It wasn't the sea, not really. It was the thing that had been waiting for me, the thing that had claimed the boat, the thing that had called me here. I knew it then. There was no escape. I was never meant to leave. I had joined them, and now they would keep me forever.
The Whispering Mist.
It was supposed to be a peaceful morning, just me and my friends out on the water, trying to catch some fish as the sun rose. We'd rented a small boat the night before in a little town by the coast, all of us excited for an early morning adventure. The air had that chill you only feel before dawn, and as we climbed aboard, you could hear the quiet lapping of the waves against the dock, the faintest of breezes brushing over the stillness. As we motored out from the harbor, the town lights grew smaller behind us, eventually fading into nothing. We were laughing, swapping stories, cracking open a few beers. Even though it was early, it felt right. Everything felt perfect, in that calm before the storm kind of way. The sunrise painted the sky in pink and orange as we drifted farther out. The horizon was just beginning to brighten, casting a warm glow over the water. But then, out of nowhere, a heavy fog started to roll in. 1 second, we were surrounded by clear skies, and the next, it was like we were in a gray void, barely able to see past the edge of the boat. "Where did this come from?" I asked, looking around as the mist thickened. Nobody had an answer. It wasn't supposed to be foggy today, at least, not according to the forecast. We kept pushing forward, thinking it would clear up, but instead, the fog only got denser. It was like a blanket, pressing down, muffling every sound, including our voices. The engine's hum faded into this eerie quiet that made my skin crawl. Our laughter died down, replaced by a tense silence. Even as I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, I couldn't ignore it. The air was so still that even breathing felt like it echoed. I don't know how long we floated in that strange fog, but eventually, Ben spoke up. "Hey, is it just me, or is it too quiet out here?" I nodded, trying to push away the sudden dread. "Yeah, it's like everything's muted, even the waves." The fog grew thicker, almost like it was alive, curling around us, reaching out as if to pull us further into its depths. It was so dense now that I could barely see the others, just shadows and outlines. I thought about checking the GPS, but when I pulled out my phone, I realized we didn't have a signal. Not that far from shore, either. And then the boat's GPS unit started to flicker, giving out static where there should have been coordinates. Great, I muttered, more to myself than anyone. My voice sounded so small, swallowed up by the fog. We had no idea where we were anymore. The fog had consumed us completely, so thick now that I couldn't see beyond the boat's edge. It was like being trapped in a tunnel of gray, with no way out, no way to tell which direction we'd come from or where we were going. The sun should have been high by now, but all we had was this unending twilight, a false dawn that seemed to stretch forever. At first, we tried to make light of it. Ben started cracking jokes, trying to break the tension, but even his voice sounded strange, like it was coming from far away. Mark pulled out a compass and started pointing us in random directions, but it didn't seem to help. The more we tried to move, the more the fog just seemed to pull us deeper into itself. That's when I heard it. It started softly, like a whisper carried on the wind, so faint I thought I might have imagined it. But then, there it was again, clearer this time. Sarah. My name. I froze. Did anyone else hear that? I asked, my voice trembling, but no one answered right away. The others just looked around, their faces pale and confused. Mark shook his head. What the hell was that? Ben muttered, squinting into the fog. You okay? Someone just called my name, I said, barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make the voice disappear. Ben laughed nervously. You're hearing things. It's just the fog, messing with your head. But I knew what I'd heard. It was clear as day. Something, had called my name. I wasn't the only one who felt it. As the silence dragged on, a chill crept down my spine. Then, another voice. Louder this time. Sarah, come closer. I looked around, my eyes wide with panic. The others hadn't heard it, not yet, but I felt it now. The air was heavier, as though something was pressing in from all sides. I could almost taste the salt of the sea on the back of my throat. It's coming from over there, I said, pointing toward the thickest part of the fog, though I couldn't be sure. There was just a vague shape in the distance, a shadow or a shifting form. It felt wrong. It felt like it wasn't part of the world I knew. Just stay calm, okay? Mark said, his voice shaking now. He was staring into the fog too, his eyes wide and unfocused. This is probably just some kind of... Stop. I interrupted, my voice cracking. I heard it again. It's right there, in the fog. I swear to God, I heard someone calling my name. We all went silent, our hearts pounding in our chests, as the boat gently rocked in the strange stillness. There was no wind, no movement, just the sound of our breathing. And then, it came again. Sarah. But this time, it wasn't just my name. It was followed by a second voice, another name. Ben. And then another. Mark. I looked at my friends, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. We were all hearing it now. Each of us had heard our names called from the fog, from the emptiness that surrounded us. But none of us had any idea where it was coming from. We couldn't tell if it was in front of us, behind us, or from the water below us. The voices were growing louder, more urgent, more insistent. And each voice sounded familiar, like someone we knew, like someone who'd already passed. I felt my stomach drop. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just the fog playing tricks on us. This was something else. Something waiting for us out there, in the gray nothingness, calling us closer. The silence that followed was the worst part. The voices had stopped, but they left an echo behind, like whispers that didn't want to fade. My heart was pounding, so loud in my chest I could barely hear the others. My hands were shaking, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. It was like I was frozen, stuck in place, unable to tear my gaze away from the fog that swallowed everything around us. I tried to calm myself, tried to reason with my mind. It's just the fog, I told myself. It's just our minds playing tricks. There's no way those were real voices. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something was very wrong. "Okay," Ben said, his voice low but strained, as if trying to control the panic in it. "Okay, let's not freak out. We need to get out of this fog. We just need to head back to the harbor, right?" He turned to start the engine, but when he tried to start the boat, it sputtered, then cut out completely. I heard a gasp from Mark. "What the hell?" His eyes were wide, searching around us, his voice trembling. "It won't start. What is going on?" The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of our breathing. My skin prickled as I looked around, feeling an oppressive weight on my chest. The air was thick with something unspoken, something ominous. "Ben, try it again," I said, my voice tight with fear. Ben's hands were shaking as he turned the key again. Nothing. The boat's engine wouldn't budge. My stomach turned as I glanced at the others. None of us knew what to do. None of us had any idea what was happening. The fog closed in tighter, and I swear, I felt it moving, creeping around us like it was alive, like it was hunting us. I tried to make out shapes through the gray mist, but there was nothing, only an endless stretch of nothingness. Then, I heard it again. Sarah, Ben, Mark. It wasn't the same as before. This time, the voices weren't just calling us from different directions. This time, the voices were closer, too close, and they didn't sound like they were coming from the air. They sounded like they were coming from beneath the water. My breath caught in my throat as I looked over the side of the boat. The water was dark, too dark, even for the early morning. It wasn't the color of the ocean. It was pitch black, like a void, swallowing everything. I could hear the voices more clearly now, but the more I listened, the less I recognized them. "Sarah, come closer." The voice was soft, but it had an edge to it, like it was trying to coax me in. But it wasn't my name anymore. It was something else, asterisk someone else star. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, my skin crawling. I didn't recognize that voice. It wasn't familiar at all. "Get us out of here," I shouted, panic rising in my chest. "No." Ben looked at me, his face pale, his eyes wide. "What's happening? Who's down there?" And then, just as quickly as it had started, the voices stopped. The boat drifted in the silence, the fog pressing in from every side. It was as if the entire world had been swallowed up. I couldn't even hear the waves anymore. It was like we were floating in a vacuum. Then I saw it. A figure. It was standing at the edge of the boat. No, it wasn't standing. It was hovering just above the water. A shadow, tall and thin, barely visible through the fog, but it was there. And it was watching us. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even breathe. "Do you see that?" Mark whispered, his voice shaking. I could barely hear him over the pounding in my ears. Before I could answer, the figure moved. Slowly, its shape shifting, gliding closer to us. It was coming for us. And then I heard the voice again, but this time, it wasn't in the fog. It wasn't in the water. It was in my head. "Come closer. We've been waiting for you." I could feel my heart slam against my chest, my body paralyzed with fear. Every instinct told me to run, to jump in the water and swim back to shore, but I couldn't move. I was trapped in this nightmare, caught between the fog, the water, and whatever the hell that thing was. I don't know how much time passed, but eventually I snapped back to reality. "Ben, start the boat!" I screamed, my voice hoarse and desperate. Ben turned the key once more. This time, the engine roared to life. But it didn't feel like we were moving. It felt like we were being pulled. The boat lurched forward, slowly at first, but then faster, as if something was dragging us. The fog was pulling us deeper, and the voices, they hadn't gone away. They were still there, whispering in the mist, coming from all directions. And now, I couldn't help but wonder, if we couldn't escape, who would be the first to disappear? We were moving now, but it didn't feel like we were escaping. The boat seemed to glide over the water, but there was no real sense of progress. The fog, thicker than ever, pressed down on us like a physical weight, and every few seconds I could feel the boat shudder as though something beneath the surface was brushing against it. Something big. Something that shouldn't be there. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the fear was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air was too still, the water too calm. It was as if we were in the eye of a storm that hadn't yet hit. I kept glancing around, expecting to see the shadowy figure again, but it was gone. For now, at least. "Ben, Mark, we need to talk about what's happening." "This isn't normal," I said, my voice shaky. I could barely hear myself over the thumping of my heart in my chest. This isn't just fog. There's something here." Ben's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and Mark was staring at the water, his face pale and ghostly. "I don't know what's going on," Ben said, his voice strained. "But I don't feel like we're alone out here. I don't feel safe. None of this makes sense." That's when it hit me. The silence. The silence had been the worst part. Not a single bird had called out. There were no waves crashing against the hull, no distant sound of other boats. It was like the world had gone dead, like everything, even nature, had been swallowed up by whatever force was lurking out here with us. I turned back toward the fog, my stomach churning. That's when I heard it again. "Sarah." I froze, blood running cold. It was unmistakable. The voice. My name. It wasn't in the fog this time. It wasn't in the water. It was behind me. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. Just the open, empty space behind us. The boat was still moving, still gliding forward through the mist, but whatever had just called my name wasn't visible. "Did you hear that?" I gasped, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark and Ben turned to look at me, their eyes wide, filled with fear. "What do you mean? What did you hear?" "The voice," I said, my voice breaking. "It was right behind me. It called my name. I heard it clear as day." There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought maybe they hadn't heard it. Maybe it was just me losing my mind. But then Ben's face went pale. I think I heard it too," he said slowly. "I thought it was just the wind, but now I'm not sure." "It's not the wind," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's something else. We're not alone." I couldn't breathe. The air in the boat felt thicker, harder to take in. Every second, the silence stretched longer and the fog closed in tighter. Then I heard the voice again. "Sarah, come closer." It was louder this time, closer. The voice didn't echo from the fog. It wasn't distant. It was right behind me again. But when I turned around, nothing was there, except for the water. The water had changed. It wasn't still anymore. The surface had ripples, small waves that seemed to grow larger by the second. And as I stared into it, the water moved. It swirled, as if something was rising up from beneath. Something massive. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, no, no." Ben turned the boat harder, the engine roaring as he tried to get us out of whatever this was. But the boat didn't respond. It was as if the water itself was holding us there, trapping us in place. Then the voice came again, but this time it wasn't just my name. It wasn't just calling us anymore. It was a scream, a shrill, agonized scream that echoed in every direction, filling the air, filling my mind. "Help me! Help me!" It was a woman's voice, a desperate, panicked scream that tore through the silence like a blade. "Who's that?" Mark shouted, his eyes darting to the water. "Who's out there?" The voice screamed again, but this time it was different. Not just a cry for help, but a pleading, a begging for something or someone. Asterisk, please. Don't leave me. Asterisk. I stared at the water, the sound of the voice still ringing in my ears. The fog had parted slightly in front of us, and I saw something there, a shadow moving beneath the surface, a dark, shapeless form that seemed to pulse, growing closer and closer with each passing second. Then everything happened at once. The boat lurched violently, like something massive had brushed against it, and we were all thrown to the side. The engine sputtered again, cutting out completely. The boat was drifting. We were stuck in the middle of the open water, surrounded by thick fog, with no way to get out, no way to escape. The last thing I remember before everything went black was hearing that voice one last time. "Come closer." Then the water broke open. I woke up to the sound of water lapping against the sides of the boat, the soft creak of the wood beneath me. My head was throbbing, and when I tried to sit up, a wave of nausea hit me like a ton of bricks. I closed my eyes and took deep breaths, trying to steady myself, but when I opened them again, I realized something was terribly wrong. The fog, it was gone. The thick mist that had been suffocating us for what felt like hours was no longer there. The sky was dark, and the moon hung low above the water, casting a strange pale glow on the scene around me. The air felt heavier than it had before, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I looked around. Ben and Mark were nowhere to be found. The boat was eerily silent, and as I slowly rose to my feet, I felt a creeping sense of dread curl around my stomach. "Ben, Mark," I called, my voice hoarse. There was no answer. The boat rocked gently, but it felt wrong. The water seemed too calm, too still, as if it were waiting for something. Or someone. I tried to move towards the controls, to start the engine and get us out of whatever nightmare we'd found ourselves in, but when I reached for the wheel, my hand froze. There, in the water beside the boat, was something floating. At first, I thought it was just debris, some piece of wood or a piece of broken rope. But as I stared harder, I saw the shape more clearly. It was a body. It was Mark. His body floated face down in the water, lifeless and pale, his limbs dangling limply at his sides. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over the edge of the boat as I gasped for air. My mind was a fog of panic and confusion. What had happened to him? I looked around frantically for Ben. There was no sign of him either. I was alone. Completely alone. Then I heard it. The voice. It was soft at first, almost a whisper, but it grew louder, closer, as if it were coming from beneath the water. The sound was unmistakable, familiar, soothing, and terrifying all at once. Sarah. It was my name. It sounded like Ben. My blood ran cold. I turned toward the water, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from the ripples that spread out around Mark's body, as though something was shifting beneath the surface. Sarah, come closer. The voice called again. It was Ben's voice, but it was distorted, twisted. It didn't sound like him anymore. It was wrong. The voice no longer carried the warmth of a friend, the safety of someone I knew. It was a taunting, hollow mockery. I backed away, my legs shaking beneath me. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but every instinct inside me was screaming that I needed to leave. But there was nowhere to go. I was trapped, alone. And then it happened. A figure emerged from the water. It wasn't Ben. It wasn't anyone I knew. The figure that rose from the water was tall, its skin pale and slick, dripping with seawater. Its eyes were dark hollows, empty, but they were locked on me with an intensity that made my heart stop. Its mouth opened, stretching unnaturally wide, and it let out a low, guttural moan, like a long-forgotten scream, one that echoed through the silence, sending a shiver of cold terror down my spine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Asterisk, help me. Asterisk, the figure croaked, its voice now a cacophony of many, twisted and layered. The water rippled again, violently this time, and the boat rocked so hard I thought it would capsize. I stumbled to the edge, almost falling in, but I caught myself just in time. The figure continued to rise, its body twisting as if the water itself were reshaping it. The face began to change, shifting in and out of familiar shapes. I saw Ben's face, then Mark's, then something that wasn't either of them. A face that was both human and monstrous at the same time. It wasn't just one thing. It was many things. The voices grew louder. I heard my name again. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a roar. A cacophony of voices, familiar voices, calling out to me from every direction. And then, the boat tipped again, more violently this time, and I felt myself falling into the water. My hands scrambled for anything to hold on to, but the figure in the water reached up, grabbing my wrist with a cold, iron grip. I screamed as it pulled me under. And I knew, I knew, there was no escaping. I was part of it now, part of the depths, forever.
The Invisible Passenger.
I don't know why I was nervous about the cruise. My boyfriend Alex and I had been talking about this trip for months. 7 days of nothing but sunshine, clear blue water, and fancy dinners on deck. I'd never been on a cruise before, but Alex assured me I'd love it. It's like a floating resort, he said, a gleam in his eyes. And he wasn't wrong. From the moment we stepped onto the ship, I was mesmerized. The place felt both luxurious and oddly old-fashioned, like stepping into a different world. After a day of exploring, we were assigned a small, cozy table near the back of the dining hall for our first dinner at sea. As we sat down, I noticed something strange. Our table for two actually had 3 chairs. The extra chair sat empty, pulled out just slightly, like someone had forgotten to sit back down. "Why 3 chairs?" I asked Alex, who just shrugged, glancing around. "Maybe it's for the server to sit down and join us," he joked, winking. When our server approached to take our order, I gestured to the chair and asked if someone else would be joining us. He looked down, frowning slightly, and his eyes darted nervously toward the seat. "Oh, that's, just for a special passenger," he muttered, almost too quietly to hear, before quickly scribbling on his notepad and disappearing without another word. "A special passenger." Alex and I exchanged a look. Maybe it was some kind of inside joke. People in the restaurant industry can be a bit superstitious, right? We laughed it off, though I felt a strange twinge in my gut. As the night wore on, I couldn't help but glance back at that empty chair every so often. I half expected someone to just appear, out of nowhere, slipping into the seat like they'd been there all along. But no one did. The chair remained empty, slightly out of place, like a silent witness. Back in our cabin later, I was too tired to mention the weird moment at dinner. The gentle rocking of the ship was surprisingly soothing, and I could feel myself drifting off almost immediately. But just as I was about to fall asleep, I swear I felt something. A cold draft, like a door left slightly open, whispering into the room. I nudged Alex, who only grumbled in his sleep, and turned over. Must be my imagination, I thought, pulling the blanket closer. I closed my eyes and tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself it was just nerves. But as I lay there, in the quiet darkness of our room, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there with us. The next night, I was more determined than ever to enjoy the cruise. I tried to brush off the eerie feeling from dinner as just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, we were on vacation. I wasn't going to let a weird extra chair ruin that. Alex and I spent the day lounging by the pool, exploring the ship, and taking in the ocean views. By dinner time, I felt like myself again, ready for a nice meal and a glass of wine. But as soon as we entered the dining hall, that strange unease crept back in. I noticed the empty chair still sitting at our table, slightly pulled out, just like before. This time, I ignored it, telling myself it didn't mean anything. As we sat down, Alex leaned over and whispered, "Want to ask about our guest again?" He was grinning, clearly trying to lighten the mood. I forced a smile, but before I could answer, our server appeared. Tonight, it was a different guy, an older man with deep lines on his face and tired eyes. He didn't seem interested in small talk, but something in me couldn't resist asking. "Excuse me," I began, nodding toward the empty chair. "Is this, extra chair always here?" The man's face went pale, and he glanced around, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. He leaned in close, lowering his voice to a whisper. "The chair," he said quietly, "is for the invisible passenger. Some people say he never really left." He straightened, quickly collecting our menus before I could respond. "Enjoy your meal," he muttered, then hurried off. Alex raised an eyebrow, looking both amused and curious. "Invisible passenger? Well, that's interesting." I tried to laugh it off, but something about the server's reaction had chilled me. My mind raced with questions. What did he mean by "never really left"? And why was everyone so uneasy about it? The meal went on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I glanced at the empty chair, I swore I could feel a presence beside us. At one point, I thought I saw the chair shift slightly, just a tiny movement, as if someone had adjusted in their seat. But when I looked directly at it, it was still. After dinner, Alex and I decided to skip dessert and head back to the cabin. As we walked through the dimly lit hallways, I couldn't help but feel that same cold draft from the night before, brushing against my neck and sending a shiver down my spine. That night, as I lay in bed, sleep didn't come easily. I kept replaying the server's words in my mind, wondering what he meant. The invisible passenger. It sounded ridiculous, like something from a ghost story. But alone in the darkness, with only the soft creaking of the ship around me, I felt anything but safe. Just as I was drifting off, I heard something that made my skin crawl, a faint whisper, like someone speaking from far away. It was so quiet I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, but I knew what I'd heard. "Welcome back." I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen, but the room had fallen silent. I turned to Alex, shaking him awake. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He opened one eye, groggy and annoyed. "Hear what?" A voice. Someone whispered. It sounded like they were right here. Alex sighed and pulled the blanket over his head. "You're just freaked out from that server's story. Go back to sleep. It's just in your head." Maybe he was right. But as I lay back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in the cabin. The next day, I tried to forget the strange happenings from the night before. I told myself it was all just nerves, maybe even seasickness mixed with a little too much imagination. But there was something lingering in the back of my mind, a prickling feeling that wouldn't let go. I tried to push it aside, throwing myself into activities with Alex. But even as we laughed and explored the ship, that icy knot of fear in my stomach stayed tight. By the time dinner rolled around, I was on edge, glancing over my shoulder more often than usual. When we stepped into the dining hall, my heart sank. There it was, the same setup as always, 2 seats for us, and that extra chair, slightly pulled out, as if waiting. Tonight, I didn't ask about it. I couldn't bear to hear more cryptic whispers or uneasy glances from the crew. As we ate, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hall was crowded, the sounds of clinking glasses and laughter filling the air, but it all felt strangely muffled, as if I were hearing it through a thick wall. At some point, I noticed Alex looking at me with concern. "You okay?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile, but before I could respond, I felt a sudden, intense chill, like an icy breath brushing across my arm. Instinctively, I turned to look at the empty chair beside me, my pulse quickening. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw something. A shadow, a faint outline, whatever it was, it disappeared the moment I blinked. I think I need some fresh air," I whispered to Alex, my voice barely steady. We left the dining hall, and I practically bolted to the open deck, breathing in the salty night air. I leaned against the railing, trying to shake the feeling of being followed. The ocean stretched out endlessly before us, vast and indifferent, and I felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. Alex put his arm around me, rubbing my shoulder. "You're really letting that story get to you, huh?" he said, trying to comfort me. "Maybe," I replied, though deep down, I knew it was more than that. The sense of being watched, of not being alone. It was becoming harder to dismiss as just nerves. That night, back in our cabin, I convinced myself it would be fine. I just needed sleep. But when we stepped inside, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the center of the room, was the chair from our dinner table. It was unmistakable. Its worn wood and deep mahogany color stood out starkly against the cream walls of our cabin. And it wasn't in the corner or by the desk. It was right in front of the bed, as if waiting. "What the hell?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Alex stared at it, just as shocked as I was. Did you ask for this to be brought here?" I shook my head, feeling the dread settle in. "No, I didn't." We stood in silence, just staring at the chair. Neither of us moved, and for a moment I thought I saw it shift, just slightly, like someone was sitting down, adjusting their weight. My skin crawled. Alex finally broke the silence, clearing his throat. "Maybe it's just a mistake. Someone must have left it here by accident." "By accident?" I repeated, the words feeling hollow. But there was no better explanation, so I let him believe it, and we pushed the chair aside, as far from the bed as possible. I didn't mention how cold it felt when I touched it, how a deep chill spread up my arm as if I'd brushed against ice. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing faint creaks and whispers, like someone moving around in our cabin, though every time I opened my eyes, the room was empty. But around 3 a.m., I woke to an unmistakable sound. Footsteps, faint but distinct, pacing the floor by the bed. My heart raced as I turned to Alex, shaking him awake. "Alex, do you hear that?" He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and listened. But just as he seemed to notice it, the footsteps stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. "Probably the ship's settling," he mumbled, lying back down. I lay awake the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet, too afraid to move. The next morning, I felt like a ghost myself, exhausted, paranoid, and desperate for answers. Alex didn't seem to grasp the seriousness of what was happening, chalking it all up to stress and fatigue. But I knew what I'd heard, what I'd seen. Whatever was happening on this ship, it wasn't just in my head. I spent most of the day quietly observing the ship's staff, watching for any sign that someone else might understand the fear gnawing at me. Finally, I worked up the courage to approach a steward, a young woman with wide, tired eyes who seemed almost as unsettled as I felt. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know anything about an invisible passenger? Someone who never left?" Her face paled immediately. She glanced around as though checking to make sure we were alone, then leaned in close. "You're talking about Cabin 131. That's the legend. The man who went overboard. But no one ever found his body." My stomach twisted. "What happened?" She shifted nervously. "They say he was a frequent passenger, always sat alone, never spoke much. But one night, he just vanished. Some think he jumped. Others say he was pushed. But ever since, strange things have happened. People hear footsteps in the corridors, see chairs move on their own." Her voice trailed off, and she looked away, her face tense. "Most of us don't talk about it." I felt a shiver run down my spine. The stories, the chair, the whispers, it all added up. I thanked her, feeling a chill settle deep into my bones as I returned to the cabin. That evening, I told Alex everything. For once, he seemed genuinely shaken, but he tried to laugh it off. "It's just a story, babe. This whole cruise thing is just getting to you." But I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the crack in his disbelief. Deep down, he was starting to feel it too. Dinner that night was quiet. We barely spoke, our eyes darting toward that empty chair more often than I wanted to admit. And then, halfway through the meal, something happened that made my blood turn to ice. The glass of water on the table began to tremble, just slightly, as if someone were tapping their fingers beside it. I froze, watching as the water rippled in steady pulses. I reached out, fingers shaking, and touched the glass, half expecting it to stop. But it kept moving. "Alex," I whispered, unable to look away. "Do you see that?" He nodded, his face pale. Slowly, he lifted his hand, gripping my arm tightly as we both stared, silent and terrified. The glass settled back down, but the silence that followed felt charged, like a static hum hanging in the air. We bolted from the dining hall as soon as we could, too shaken to stay. Back in the cabin, Alex locked the door, his face tight with worry. "Okay, maybe there's something weird going on," he admitted, his voice barely audible. I nodded, still feeling that horrible chill. The steward said, "There was a man who disappeared from the ship. They say he still lingers." Alex shook his head, half in disbelief, half in fear. "Why us, though? Why is this happening to us?" "I don't know," I whispered, hugging myself, trying to ignore the cold that seemed to creep in from the corners of the room. "But I don't think he wants us here." Just as I spoke, the lights in the cabin flickered, casting strange, twisted shadows across the walls. In that moment, I felt a presence, something unseen, but undeniably there, hovering, watching. It felt oppressive, like the room itself was closing in, trapping us. Alex pulled me close, his breathing shallow. "We're almost halfway through this cruise," he said, as if trying to convince himself. "Just a few more days, and we'll be home." But deep down, I wasn't sure we'd make it that long. Something dark and unseen was with us, something that didn't want us to leave. And as I lay in bed that night, wide awake, I could swear I felt it. The invisible weight of eyes watching us, waiting for us to slip up, to let down our guard. And then, just before I finally drifted off to a restless sleep, I heard it again, a faint whisper, almost a sigh, coming from the empty chair in the corner. "Don't go." By the last night of the cruise, I was unraveling. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt a heavy, suffocating presence pressing in on me. My nerves were frayed, my thoughts tangled, and Alex was no better. We barely spoke, just exchanged glances filled with unspoken terror and exhaustion. It was as if the ship itself had turned hostile, every creak and groan taunting us, reminding us that we weren't alone. That evening, as we prepared for dinner, a strange feeling washed over me, a gut instinct, an undeniable urge telling me not to go to the dining hall. But routine, desperation for normalcy, drove us there anyway. This time, as we approached the table, my heart dropped. The empty chair had been moved again, and this time it was pulled closer to our seats. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to join us more intimately, invading our space. I couldn't look away, my eyes glued to that vacant chair. The air around it felt charged, colder than the rest of the room, almost as if an invisible figure sat there, silently watching us. As we ate in strained silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping began. It came from the table, 3 taps, then a pause, then 3 taps again. I clenched my fists, every nerve on edge, and looked at Alex, whose eyes were wide with fear. He'd noticed it too. Without a word, he reached for my hand, his fingers cold and trembling. We abandoned our dinner, barely tasting it, and headed back to the cabin, both of us on the verge of panic. As we hurried down the corridor, I felt the distinct sensation of someone walking behind us. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, there was no one there, just empty space, stretching out like a dark, endless void. Back in the cabin, we tried to barricade ourselves, shoving furniture against the door, though deep down we both knew it was futile. Whatever was haunting us didn't need doors or walls to find its way in. In a desperate attempt to distract ourselves, we turned on the small television in the room, flipping mindlessly through channels, but nothing could drown out the heavy silence. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse and shift, darkening with each passing minute. Then, just past midnight, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into total darkness. The only sound was our own breathing, sharp and ragged, until a faint rustling filled the room, as if someone or something was moving closer. I held my breath, listening, my pulse pounding in my ears. And then, a whisper, soft, chilling, filled the air. "You're not supposed to be here." My body went cold. The voice was right next to me, so close that I could almost feel its breath on my neck. I reached for Alex in the darkness, clinging to him, desperate for any sense of grounding. But his grip was as shaky as mine. "We need to leave," I whispered, panic rising in my chest. "Now." We fumbled in the darkness, grabbing what we could, desperate to escape. But as we reached for the door, it refused to budge. It was as if some unseen force was holding it shut, trapping us inside. My heart raced, pounding so hard I thought it might burst. And then, in the silence, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the room, coming closer and closer. My mind raced, searching for some explanation, but I couldn't deny it any longer. The ghost of the invisible passenger was real. And it didn't want us here. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the door suddenly swung open with a violent force. We didn't hesitate. We bolted, running through the dimly lit hallways, desperate to escape whatever horror lurked behind us. We stumbled up to the deck, gasping for air, and leaned against the railing, the night air cold and biting. Alex clutched my hand, both of us too shaken to speak. Below us, the dark ocean stretched endlessly, vast and silent, offering no comfort. I could feel that same oppressive presence, as if it was still watching, waiting for us to let down our guard. The cruise ended the next morning, and as soon as we docked, we practically ran off the ship. But even as we returned home, the memories lingered, every sound, every shadow, every icy touch. It haunted me, the feeling that we'd escaped with something clinging to us, something that might follow us wherever we went. To this day, I don't talk about it much. People wouldn't believe me if I tried. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still feel it, that cold, invisible presence. A reminder that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed.